This video is for the second part of Chapter 2 from Miller, Living in the Environment for AP Environmental Science. So the second part of this chapter is looking at what is energy, what's the definition of energy, and then what happens to it as it changes. So when we talk about energy, we need to remember a couple of sort of the big ideas, and that is whenever energy is converted from whenever energy is converted from one form to another, there is a physical or a chemical change happening. And that means it's just changing shape, it's changing form. There is no energy that's being destroyed. There is no energy that's being created out of nothing. And that's referred to as the first law of thermodynamics. So all matter, all energy that exists in the universe is already there. And so that's an important thing to remember. Even though there are things that we cannot see, it's still there. It just might be in a different form. The second idea is that when we do have energy convert from one form to another, and it's going from physical to chemical or vice versa, then usually there's going to be a change in the quality of that energy. So it's going from a high quality energy, which means that energy is very concentrated, there's more of it in one smaller amount, to a much lower quality of energy, meaning the electrons, the things inside it, are a lot more dispersed, so it's kind of harder to access and use that energy. So going through the first part of the chapter is understanding that energy comes in different forms. So we have, before I even get to that, we have to remember that energy is defined as the capacity to do work or to transfer heat. So heat is a form of energy. And we need to remember that there's two types. We've got kinetic energy or potential energy. And kinetic energy is defined as the energy of motion. So we're looking mostly at the movement of atoms and the movement of those electrons around those atoms in those structures that they make up. Kinetic energy can be heat energy, or also referred to as thermal energy. It can also be electromagnetic energy, which is looking at light, the light spectrum. And then the second type is potential energy, which is it's stored energy. It's energy that's not being used yet. It's sitting there stored, ready and available to do work. It just hasn't been accessed or used yet. So make sure you understand this figure and this caption down here, and it's talking about visible light. Visible light is a form of energy, and it's made up of different wavelengths of light, going from very condensed, shorter wavelengths such as gamma rays, all the way to TV and radio waves, which are a much longer wavelength, meaning distance between the peaks. And so just remember that light is a form of energy. So moving on to the next page, looking at this again, remember potential energy is energy that is stored. So here they use this example of a picture of water stored behind a dam. The water is here sitting, kind of waiting. As the dam gets open, the water starts to move through, and that can generate energy inside the dam using a turbine, which we'll talk about second semester. But it's going from standing energy to moving energy, so from potential to kinetic. The other thing, or another part, which I kind of mentioned already, is just remember what exactly does high-quality energy mean? And that is energy that's got a high capacity to do useful work, meaning organisms can access that energy. It can be useful. So high temperature heat, concentrated sunlight, high speed wind, for example, energy that comes from coal, oil, and gas. Those are all examples of high quality energy because they are condensed into a smaller area. Moving on to the the next page. Low quality energy, on the other hand, again, it's too dispersed. It's too dispersed to be useful as far as doing work. There's a large number of moving molecules. So, for example, the ocean. The ocean is really big. It's very vast. It covers 70% of the Earth's surface, but the molecules, it's too spread out to be a useful form of potential energy. Same thing with the molecules that are moving around in the atmosphere. The atmosphere is too big. The gases are too dispersed, and so it's not a very useful concentrated form of energy. The next part of the chapter is talking about the difference between the first and second law of thermodynamics. So make sure you understand both of them. The first law of thermodynamics, sometimes also referred to as the law of conservation of energy. Again, it's simply stating that energy cannot be created nor destroyed. It simply gets changed from one form into another. And then the second law of thermodynamics is talking about the change in the quality, so going from high quality to low quality energy. And so when we talk about energy second semester, one of the things that we need to remember about that is as we're using energy, for example, as we burn coal or oil or natural gas, it's going from that high quality energy and it's escaping, a lot of it escapes as heat, and that becomes a low quality energy, so we can't really harness it and we can't really do anything with it. So it's not a very efficient form of energy in the sense of being able to kind of capture it and reuse it again. So we'll talk more about that second semester. All right, for Section 4 is looking at systems and understanding what is a system. So you need to know that a system is just a set of components that work together. There are things that go into the system. There are things that come out of the system. They work together in different ways. And in biology, you learn, for example, about the different human body systems. Well, that's a system. Just like in the environment, you have different examples of systems. An ecosystem is a system. Okay, there's different things or different components that go together. They work together. There are things that go into the ecosystem. There are things that come out. So you need to make sure you're very clear on what these definitions mean. Feedback is defined as a process that's going to increase, decrease, or stabilize a change. Okay, and so then you have something called a feedback loop, which is right here, and it's talking about what's causing changes to that system. So a really important concept for APES is understanding what is a feedback loop, what is the difference between a negative and a positive feedback loop. And so it kind of gets a little confusing because some people think, well, positive is a good thing, right? Well, instead of thinking of positive as a good thing, remember positive is represented as a plus sign. Plus, if it's a plus, we're adding to it. So a positive feedback loop is going to cause a system to change and continue to change in that same direction. So over here, they show this really good diagram right here, and they're talking about decreasing vegetation, and you have erosion because as you have less plant matter, you have less roots to hold the soil in place. So then you have more erosion happening as it continues over time because you have less soil to hold plants in place. You have less plants, you have more erosion happening, and it just keeps amplifying. It keeps increasing in the same direction. That's a positive feedback. Not because it's a good thing, but because the effect keeps adding to itself. Okay, on the other hand, a negative feedback is also sometimes referred to as a corrective feedback loop, and that's where it's going to go in the opposite direction. So in most science textbooks, you see the example of a thermostat. Okay, and a thermostat is that little computer that you have that's connected to your air conditioning or to your heating system, and you set it to a specific temperature. And so what happens is when the temperature, say we turn on the air conditioning because it's hot outside and we have it set to 78 degrees. Well, as soon as the temperature in the room gets above that temperature, so say it gets to 79 or 80 degrees, the thermostat kicks on. It tells your air conditioning to run. And then when the temperature drops to 78 or below, then the thermostat kicks off and it turns off. So it's shutting it off, and basically it's kind of going back on and off based off of that temperature. So it's kind of counteracting the change that's happening in the room to kind of keep it stable, which is how our bodies work as well. When we talk about feedback loops, we have to remember that it does take a long time for systems, especially ecosystems, to respond to feedback or changes that are happening in the environment. And that's referred to as a time delay. Now, sometimes that means that you have problems that kind of start adding and increasing slowly and slowly and slowly until things start getting more dramatic and you get to a threshold or a tipping point. And that means a tipping point is where the system has changed so much that it's like not going to really change anymore, or at some point it's going to break. Okay, that system will break. And so that's something that we'll talk about later on when we start looking at changes in climate and some other examples, which I'll leave for later on. All right, and then for the last part of the chapter, just make sure that you go over this. This is looking again at not only the example of negative feedback, so looking here at the example of the thermostat, but also the idea of models. How are models useful? Why are models useful in science? How do they work? And then what are some of the limitations? So make sure that you take time and you read through this, this section as well.